Okay, so we're still sticking really with this second wave of psychology that began with behaviorism and then extended to social learning theories and then to cognitive theories. So George Kelly is the best known cognitive theorist who had a theory of personality. But his ideas are directly influenced by Piaget, and his terms he uses and his understanding of the processes at play is all congruent with Piaget's theory. And so I think I really should set the scene by explaining the basic principles from Piaget's theory, and then we can talk about how Kelly used these to explain his theory of personality. So Piaget's theory, I'm sure you're familiar with again from Intro to Psych. I won't spend too much time on the stages, okay, just the main construction process and the main components that you need to know for the exam and for Kelly's theory. But also John Piaget is worth studying because he's by far the most influential and most well-known developmental psychologist. So every psychological theorist in the past several decades has undoubtedly been influenced by his theory. But even though he's the most known developmental psychologist, he didn't regard himself as a developmental psychologist. He called himself a genetic epistemologist, meaning the origins of knowledge. Genesis, of course, meaning origins, epistemology, meaning knowledge. And then, as I'm sure you're aware, his theory is that people develop cognitively from birth through a series of stages, and there's 4 stages to this theory. And then he's responsible for popularizing the term construction, which is a term also used, though slightly differently, by George Kelly, who was a psychotherapist and a personologist, meaning that to understand someone's personality, you have to get to know the person and you have to study people on a person-by-person basis. And Kelly considered the father of cognitive clinical psychology, and his personality theory is personal construct psychology, which we'll get to. So Piaget, born in 1896 in Switzerland, he was a child prodigy, okay? At 10 years of age, he published his first academic paper in a journal. It was on the albino sparrow and describing his observations of it. And then throughout his childhood and his teenage years, he continues to publish fairly regularly in academic journals to do with natural integration. His main area was seashells and land shells. And he became so well known and so well cited in the literature that he was actually reached out to by a natural museum and a natural history museum and asked if he would be the curator. And his parents had to write back saying, sorry, he's done high school, so he can't take the job. Okay, and then in 1918, he graduated with his doctoral degree, wanted to combine what he understood about biology with his interests in psychology and philosophy. In Paris, he began his theory when he was devising and administering reading tests to school children, and he observed that there was differences between the children to do with age, okay, so that there was commonalities to children who were similar in age and clear differences between them and children who were older or children who were younger. And after this, in 1929, he became a professor at Geneva in child psychology, and then he remained there until his death in 1980. So at the core of Piaget's theory is this term schemas. Schemas are categories of knowledge, but also processes that we use for acquiring knowledge. So if I say cat, something in your mind lights up because you can recognize a cat when you see one. You have a schema of what is meant by a cat. You picture, something with 4 legs and a tail and whiskers, and so there's characteristics that you understand. But also a schema can be a script of expectations. So if you're going to a restaurant tonight, that means you're going to sit at a table, you're going to choose food from a menu, you're going to eat, you're going to have to pay for the food you're going to leave. And so there's a series of steps that you understand what's meant by a restaurant experience. But as we gain in age, And so as we progress through cognitive development, our schemas become more and more sophisticated, okay? They broaden and they deepen. So, if I asked a young child what they understand by the term education, their schema is going to be quite limited. They might describe, what school is like, but you understand the more complicated view of education, right? That it includes school education, but not college education. It can include postgraduate education. It can include non-academic forms of education. And so your understanding of education is broader and deeper because you have more experience in the world. And so your schema is more sophisticated. And so our schemas expand in sophistication through adaptation, which is the changing of schemas. And this has two forms, okay? There's two forms of adaptation: assimilation and accommodation. So assimilation is incorporating new experiences that are congruent with your schema to broaden it or to deepen it, so to increase the sophistication. So, for example, a little kid has seen domestic house cats before. They have a schema for what a cat is. And then they go to the zoo for the first time, and there's a sign that says big cats, and they see lions and tigers for the first time. And, they recognize it as a cat, but suddenly they realize cats can be larger than they understood cats to be before. And so the parent then explains there's different types of cats. There's, lions and tigers and smaller house cats. And so the child now has a more sophisticated understanding of what's meant by cats because they've assimilated this knowledge into their schema. And now they understand there's different types of cats and they can be in different sizes. And then accommodation is changing your existing schemas to explain new experiences that are not congruent with the schema that you have. So maybe this kid has never seen a dog before, and then he sees the dog for the first time and he points at it and says cats because there's some similarities. They have, 4 legs and they're both pets and both have tails and so on. But then maybe the parent has to explain, this isn't a cat. There's differences, and then explains the differences. One goes meow, one goes with. And so through this, they're having to change what they understand about a cat, right? Before they thought all 4-legged pets were cats, now they have to understand that actually that's not true. There's exceptions to this, and so they have to modify their schema and then also create a new schema for a dog.
There are types of schemas under adaptation.
There are types of adaptation. No, so schemas, they're what changes the schemas, what adapts the schemas. Okay, so schemas are just categories of knowledge. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so in Piaget's theory, cognition is a systematic process of learning and constructing through experience, okay? So you're constructing schemas of the world as you experience the world, and they are increasing in sophistication as you have more enriched learning experiences and have new encounters. So in his understanding, development is mutually independent between the person and the environment, which was pretty groundbreaking at the time, and for some might still be somewhat difficult to comprehend because other theorists that we've covered have mostly debated the idea of one having innate knowledge or coming into the world as blank slates. Carl Jung said, that there's a collective unconscious, okay, and so it might be not at the conscious level, but it's there in the mind somewhere, okay, because of our collective history. And then on the opposite side of that, the behaviorists said that people come into the world with no knowledge, they're blank slates, and they learn passively. But Piaget would say both of these are incorrect, okay? How does a child learn about distance? It's not the case that they come into the world with some knowledge of distance already, and it's not the case that they learn purely passively, just from observing. They learn through interacting, okay? They try to reach something, they realize they can touch it, they try to reach something else, realize they can't touch that. And so through interacting with the world, they're having an understanding of distance that's broadening and deepening again as they get older and they interact more and more with the world. So through trial and error is how they're learning. So in Piaget's theory, a well-adjusted person is always assimilating and always accommodating in order to broaden and deepen their understanding of the world so it better reflects reality. Okay, the more sophisticated it is, the more likely it is to actually be reflective of the real world. So this process is called equilibrium, trying to create a healthy balance between assimilation and accommodation, right? Because if there is too much accommodation, if one is too easily swayed by the minor inconsistencies in the world, then they'll always be accommodating, and then they won't have very reliable or stable schemas, okay? If every tiny little inconsistency makes you completely change your schema and create a whole new schema to explain it, then that's going to cause problems. Whereas on the other end, if one never accommodates, if they have schemas that are rigid, then they'll no longer represent reality. They're not deepening and broadening. So one always has to be incorporating new information and accommodating as well. And then adults are able to make generalizations, moving from a specific meaning to a general meaning, and deductions, which is the opposite, moving from a general meaning to a specific meaning. So, if I told you all that someone is practicing swimming, you wouldn't therefore think that that will have any impact on their tennis playing or their golf playing. But a young child might make this mistake because, according to Piaget, children before 7 suffer from transduction, which is making a connection between two things that are actually irrelevant. So in one study, Piaget told children about a story of a man with a hunchback who had the flu, and then he has a vaccine for the flu. And then the children are asked, does he still have a hunchback? And children below 7 who were suffering from transduction said no, thinking that the vaccine had cured his hunchback, even though there's no connection between the two. Whereas after 7, they were able to make the distinction, would say, yes, he still has the hunchback, it's the flu that's been dealt with, that's been treated. So another example of transduction, maybe a kid is waiting at the train station, they're waiting for a long time, and then a dog barks, and then suddenly the train finally arrives. They might think that the dog barking is what caused the train to arrive. So it's making a connection between two things that are not relevant to each other. So the first stage of Piaget's theory is the sensorimotor stage, occurring between the first 2 years. Infants right now are using senses and motor abilities to understand the world. So the equilibrium process here is purely like reflex cycles, and there's 2 forms of this. There's the primary circular reactions, which is circular reactions with the child interacting with themselves, so sucking their thumb over and over again. And so some action becomes a stimulus, and then it's interesting to them, and so they respond to it by repeating it. Whereas a secondary circular reaction is that which extends to the environment. So, giggling at their mother because they realize that that produces a smell and a giggle from their mother, and so they continue to do this because they're getting some reaction from the environment. Or maybe having a rubber duck in the bath and realizing if you squeak it, it produces a noise. And then they continue to squeak it because they like the sound of the noise. So, the child is learning here through interacting with the world, right? So they learn as they, tilt their heads, they're increasing their span of vision. By looking this way, they can see things that they couldn't see by looking this way. And by squeaking some areas of the duck, they get a noise, whereas by pushing other areas of the duck, they don't get the same squeak. And then the biggest hallmark of this stage is object permanence, understanding that something exists even if you can't see it. Okay, so before this, before the age of 2, children often think if it's out of sight, then it doesn't exist. So if they're playing with a toy and then you hide that toy between a cushion, they won't look for it because they think it no longer exists. Whereas by the end of this stage, children will look behind the cushion for the toy because they understand that it still exists, even though they can't see it. And there's a whole range of studies on object permanence, some of them quite interesting, and some of them showing children some impossible events. It's clearly a visual trick, but it looks like one object passing through another object into some other sort of manner. And children less than 2 won't give any response to it because they don't understand that it's impossible. But children after 2 will show some surprise to it because it doesn't fit with the way that the world works. And and if this was a developmental class, we could talk in detail about studies on object permanence. But for the purposes of this, just understanding that object permanence is the hallmark of this stage is enough. And then the next stage is the preoperational stage between 2 and 7, when children begin to develop symbolic thoughts, meaning mental representation and meaning that one thing can symbolize something else. So this is when they might begin to use a cardboard box as a piece of furniture when playing houses, or use a stick as a sword or a broomstick when playing knights or witches or whatever they're doing. But they understand that one thing can symbolize something else. Now, furthermore, they become able to understand past and future. So if you tell them, we're not going to the park right now, but we'll go later, you understand what's meant by that. It means we're not going right now, but we're going some point soon in the future. Now, my main area of research is children's eyewitness memory and children's interviews with police when they've witnessed a crime. And so the literature on temporal questions, which is, asking children how long ago something happened, or if they're talking about a series of events, asking if one thing happened before or after something else. Children, what the literature on this suggests is that before 4 years of age, children find it basically impossible to answer temporal questions. Between 4 and 7, there's big advancements in being able to understand temporal questions. But even by the age of 7, it's not completely resolved. There continues to be advancements until about age 10 in terms of being able to understand and answer temporal questions. During early childhood, children are egocentric, meaning that they are not aware that other people can see things that they can't see or have thoughts that they don't have. So in Piaget's study, he had a model of a mountain range. Piaget sat at one side, the kid sat at the other side. He asked the kid, "What do I see?" meaning Piaget, and then he asked the children to select from a number of photographs, but the children would select the one that they could see, not the one that Piaget could see, so long as they were still egocentric. But by the end of this stage, once they were no longer egocentric, they could point to the one that Piaget saw. It's congruent with the theory of minds, right? So you're familiar with this. This was developed after Piaget's theory, but it's congruent. Theory of mind is that you understand other people have different views and beliefs and understandings than you do. It's usually demonstrated via a false belief task. So you tell children, some scenario, Sally and Bob are in the kitchen. Sally puts the chocolate bar in the cupboard. Bob leaves the kitchen, and then Sally worries that the chocolate will melt, so puts the chocolate in the fridge. Bob then returns because he's hungry to eat the chocolate bar. Where does he look? And a child who is still egocentric will say he looks in the fridge because that's where it is. Where else would he look? But a child who has theory of mind and is no longer egocentric understands that it's actually in the cupboard, okay? Because Bob doesn't have the full story. He has a different understanding of what happens, and so he thinks it's in the cupboard, so that's where he'll look. Children who are 4 years of age pretty much always fail the false belief task. Children who are 6 pretty much always pass the false belief task. And then there's individual differences at age 5, okay? But by age 6, children typically have theory of mind, which is congruent with Piaget's theory that by the end of this stage, children are no longer egocentric. And then during this stage, because children are egocentric, or at least in the earlier parts of this stage, children also look for explanations that fit with their understanding of the world, okay? So a child asks you, where does the moon go during the day? So long as they're still egocentric, they're not going to be satisfied with any logical complicated answer like, about the Earth's orbit. Okay, what they're looking for is something that fits their understanding. They'll be satisfied with an answer like, during the day the moon gets tired and so it goes to sleep, because they can relate to that. They also get tired and they also go to sleep when they're tired. And then this is somewhat why also children often give human characteristics to objects and talk to them as if they're human-like, which is called animism. So, talking to your teddy bear or talking to a car as if it's a thing, as if it's a person. And then this may also be why during this stage, children often enjoy playing with dolls and playing with action figures and things such as this, because they can give, some sort of life form to what they're playing with. And then also because children at this stage have a quite narrow view of things, they don't tolerate inconsistencies or exceptions, okay? And so what we see at this stage is a strong sense of moral realism, meaning that they want the letter of the law to be observed, okay? And they'll be very upset if laws are broken. So if you're playing a game with a young child, a board game or some other game, and you break the rules of the game, the child will be very upset by this, okay? Because at this stage, they're not tolerant when it comes to inconsistencies. And then the third stage is the concrete operational stage between 7 and 11, when one begins to develop mental calculations or operations, such as conservation. So a child before this, if there's 2 beakers, one short fat beaker and one long thin beaker, and you transfer water from the short fat one to the long thin one, they'll think that there's more water suddenly because it's taller, even though they've just watched the same amount of water be passed from one to the other. But once they understand conservation, then they understand that actually it's the same amount of water just in 2 differently shaped beakers. And this is also when they understand reversibility, that something can be reversed. And then according to Piaget, this is when willpower develops, okay? As their understanding of things become broader and deeper, and they become more tolerant of exceptions and inconsistencies, they begin to realize that they can make personal judgments, okay? That there's options open to them, that they don't have to behave one particular way all the time. So if your mother tells you to clean your room, you can clean your room, or you can choose to do something else. You can make a personal judgment. So this is what occurs when one leaves behind the egocentric moral realism of the previous stage. Okay, and then the final stage, formal operation stage, 11 plus. And when children begin to develop the ability to think abstractly, hold multiple thoughts at the same time, and can think systematically, meaning that they can have predictions over what will happen, and then look for evidence that will support the predictions or not support. And they have higher language ability and begin to work towards their maximum potential to make generalizations and reductions. But most importantly, the workings of personality here are also understood through assimilation and accommodation and the growing sophistication of schemas. So this is important, right? What Piaget's theory is holistic. He's saying that the mechanisms that are responsible for cognitive development are also responsible for social and personality development, because all of development is interconnected, which is in contrast to Erikson, right? Erikson also had stages of development, but he said they were purely to understand social or personality development. He would have said that cognitive development has a completely separate set of mechanisms, and so needs another theory to explain it, because he has a modular theory, whereas for Piaget, it's a holistic view, so everything is interconnected. So how does this explain personality? Well, maybe there's a 13-year-old girl who wants to be sociable, but what she understands sociable to mean is to be maybe polite and agreeable and to listen to people. Okay, that's her schema of what it means to be sociable. Maybe she doesn't understand that it also means to reveal something about yourself and to ask questions so you're getting to know the person on a deeper level. And so if she's not assimilating this knowledge, then she won't perhaps be making friends on the playground, perhaps she'll find herself being lonely because she isn't growing the sophistication of what is meant by being sociable. Now, the context of our schemas are obviously influenced by our environment, especially at an early age. But Piaget would say it's up to the person to construct their schemas, especially as they grow in age, they have more free will, more conscious awareness, can choose to assimilate knowledge or not. And then this will lead very nicely into George Kelly's theory, who follows the same principles in explaining personality. Okay, I covered quite a lot there. Any questions on Piaget's work? Okay, feel free to come up and ask questions if there is. Otherwise, thanks everyone. Have a good weekend. I'll see you next time.